As AI continues to evolve, many employees are feeling this sense of uncertainty. They're worried about new tools that aren't here to help, but to replace them. Is this fear really about the technology, or is it about how we, as leaders and teams, navigate through these changes? Because at the end of the day, that's the problem with AI.
That's the problem with AI. Doesn't see or cry. Talk about the future, but forget why.
Welcome to another edition of The Problem with AI. Today we're talking about people and safety. Even just this week, we had ChatGPT 01 release come out. We have the new iPhone, which is going to have Apple's artificial intelligence in it. Google has released an amazing tool, Notebook LM, where you can literally generate a podcast-style discussion on any documents, references, and sources. So AI has become a persistent thing, and now it's a thing that's in our pocket and will probably never go away. So as we start thinking about that in the people and safety sort of domain, I want to introduce my co-host, Scott Sehlhorst, who is with us every time. Scott, what is top of your mind when you think about people and safety and AI and that very big, complex topic?
Hey, John, thanks. Thrilled to be here with Marty today. One of the things that came up, I remembered reading some headlines several years ago about a person who got fired because he subcontracted his work to other people. He hired other people at a much lower cost to do his work for him and basically paid them, a portion of his salary to get his time back. And when his employer found out, they fired him because he wasn't doing the work. Someone else was doing the work, even though he, contained it all sort of responsibly. And when we think about AI, what's starting to emerge is it a tool or is it a collaborator, right? And the dynamics of interaction with it start to feel a little bit different. So one of the things I'd like to dig into today is if you are subcontracting to an AI to do some of your work for you, is that the same?
Luckily, we do have an expert with us today to talk about these topics and more. Welcome, Marty. Marty Bradley is an AI engineer. He's an AI trainer. He's big in the generative AI space. Marty, what are your thoughts? You heard what Scott had to say. Does that trigger anything for you?
Yeah, but first I want to start off by saying, John and Scott, it's great to be here with you guys. And Scott, you always like kind of nail it. About 4 years ago, I was using another tool before ChatGPT and things came out, and I used it to help me write a book. And a couple of people, when they found out about that, basically asked me, do you feel like that's cheating? And at first I had, it kind of took me aback for a minute because I didn't think of it like that, right? I thought like it was helping me because I was thinking about it more as a collaborator. So it's interesting that you went down that path because when you think about that, like the example you use, because I remember a guy that I work with, same kind of thing happened to him. He'd be gone for like part of the day. And what it turns out is he was working with these other people to do his work, and he would show up at work just to be physically there. And he also got fired. But the way I've been looking at it more and more is that these tools, if you think about it, it's like, remember when Outlook, the tools, they started getting integrated, PowerPoint and Project and all these things, right? And they had templates in them and things like that. And at the beginning, they used to show up in job descriptions saying, you have to have like Word skills or Microsoft Office skills. And it almost became a joke after a while because it was just the thing that you did. You used Word to help you write. You used grammar checkers and things like that. And I think that's where we're heading with AI. It's going to be in the next, who knows how long, is it next year? Or is it the year after? But on every job description, it's going to be, are you proficient in using AI technologies to help you do your job? I don't think the technologies are at the point. I'll kind of pose this question to you guys. I mean, if I think about you guys, you're both obviously very intelligent. I work with both of you on different accounts, and then you're also consultants. So you see different things that different people do, and then you also train people, right? And I think all of those things kind of teach you more and more. And I would bet that both of you use something like ChatGPT on a fairly regular basis, right? Is that a true statement?
I think it's fair to say just about every professional out there now is using it in some fashion, even if you think of the people only using Grammarly, Grammarly has a lot of AI models behind it now. So that's the majority of college students. That's a lot of people writing documents, business documents. GPT has become so widespread and ubiquitous, everybody pulls it up and uses it a little bit. That being said, so the hyperbole of everybody, I have to pull myself back immediately because I work with people that tell me, you need to show me what it does. I've never used it before. They're a little afraid to dip in. And it's not even a generational thing. It is the fact that some people just have no need. It's not part of their daily life yet. I think as the iPhone comes out with intelligence, as your mobile computer in your pocket comes out and it's just a thing, I'm curious how much it becomes, do you use AI? Because honestly, we all do. There's algorithms everywhere and becomes more, is it even a thing anymore? Is it really just the internet? Nobody says, do you use the internet? It's just assumed. It's no longer a question of are you using it? It's how are you using it? And is it intentional use? I think you mentioned AI skills, and that made me immediately think internet skills. We saw that in the late 90s, early 2000s on like job requisitions. You have to be familiar with the internet, you have to understand the internet, things like that. It's no longer put out there, it's just assumed. Are we moving kind of that direction, Scott? What does it feel like we're moving to be just the AI is a thing, or will it continue to be a unique skill set?
If I tried to look forward by looking backwards, I can remember when spell check first showed up in some of the programs like Microsoft Word, and it would catch your typos when you fat fingered something. But if you used there, or there incorrectly, you spelled the word right, but in context it was wrong, it didn't catch it. And then a couple few years later, it started to catch that. And then it started making recommendations of, oh, you used the wrong one. Let me fix it for you. And then I think I noticed it first in Gmail. I don't know if it's in other places. Tab to complete your sentence, right? That shift now, all of these things are sort of increments along the make it a little bit easier for me to do what I'm trying to do. It's not displacing my thinking. It's, you tab to complete best regards, Scott, or whatever on at the end of your email or the finish of the sentence. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Like that would be the kind of thing that I would include in an email along with write a presentation for a client or something. And that doesn't feel like I'm doing something different. It feels like it's just a little bit better. By analogy, in the software world, there was one time in college, so late 80s for me, where I sat down and I wrote a program and I wrote it out longhand. And this is kind of ridiculous, but I wrote it on paper longhand and then I went to the computer lab and typed it in and it worked. No bugs, nothing. Like one and done. The only time I've ever done it in my entire career. Never done it since, but I'm still going to take credit for doing it once, where I had to write it longhand and then type it in, and then it worked. Coding got a lot better when you got compilers that would let you know when what you wrote was wrong. And then red, green refactor, and you started to add test suites and unit tests, and you develop some of the engineering of software development where you would get the feedback that what you did was wrong, but in a more abstract level. Like it wasn't just that it didn't compile, it was that it didn't work or didn't work the way you intended it to work, right? To be really pedantic. And I think the same sort of evolution of tools, we wouldn't criticize somebody for using a compiler when they're programming. And so what are the next steps? Right, to recommend a function call or to identify that, oh, you used the wrong variable name. I think what you're trying to do, you actually should be accessing this other structure. Or we're going to recommend a particular data structure based on what we can observe about what you're trying to implement. Right, those kinds of increments, just like spell check, contextual use, sentence completion, those feel like natural incremental innovation, although that's an oxymoron, that are improvements that don't change how we think about what we're doing. They just make us better at what we were already doing.
We hear AI is going to replace everything. Authoring a book's a good example. The early complaints came from the creative groups, the authors, the actors, the audiobook narrators, that AI is taking our jobs. It's taking creative jobs. Business is now worried about it. Workers are worried about it. There are studies that say over the next 6 years, 60% of current jobs will be gone. That creates a real lack of safety, and it leaves people very confused because on one hand, they hear it's just a tool. And on the other hand, they hear it's a world-changing thing that's going to put them out of a job. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, and that's why I think that we need to think about this right now as more. It's not a tool issue that we're talking about or a product issue. It's a people and a training issue. As people use it more and more, they're going to understand it, right? So kind of going back to what Scott's saying, part of the training that I do is that I teach that for every deliverable in any role, you can use AI to streamline it, right? To make it go faster. And as I've trained people to do that, we found over and over again that almost none of the deliverables are 100% automatable. But what happens is they actually get better at creating the deliverable because as they go, and if you focus on deliverables, the nice thing about it is it's like creating working tested software, right? If you create a deliverable, you can say, okay, if I did this by hand, it would take me 24 hours, 3 days, probably elapsed time, whatever. But if I build myself a tool, I might be able to get it done in 4 hours. Well, if that's what you're doing, you're the one that understands. You have the cognitive ability to understand if that's a good answer or some just played out. I mean, we've seen this, right? When you feed in information into an LLM, the information you get out is going to sound pretty good, but there are nuanced things that are incorrect, right? Things that we know based on the environment and people that we're working with that there's no way the AI can understand. And so what ends up happening is we can kind of offload our rote tasks. Like if I have to create a PowerPoint deck, for example, I was creating a course, and for a section of a course, it used to take me probably about for one section, it take me about 16 hours, about 2 days, right? Because I'd have to go through it, I'd have to write some code, I'd test the code, and then I'd go build the slides, have to put them in PowerPoint, and then I'd rework the outline because it was out of order and things like that. So by the time I went back and forth a bunch of times and redrafted and finalized, it'd probably take me about 2 days. If I go into ChatGPT now, I can basically walk through, explain to it what I want to do, right? So I'm giving it the knowledge. It's like, hey, I want a course. It does this. They're beginner learners, whatever steps I go through to describe it to ChatGPT or whatever. And it'll come back and give me a nice outline. And then I can work with it to fine tune that outline a little bit, change some things around, and then go, okay, let's detail out these couple things. Okay, now go ahead and generate a PowerPoint deck for me. And so it formats and brings the deck back. And then at that point, all I have to do is add some pictures, right? That process probably take me 3 hours, start to finish, and edit it. Now, could somebody else go create that deck? Maybe, right? But they would have to know what I know and the intent of what I'm trying to teach and how I'm going to teach it to get all of those things done. So it would be no different than me sitting down with one of you guys and talking through, hey, what do you think this course? What do you think of this outline? Well, I think that's out of order and that sounds confusing. Do you really want to say it like that? So now what's happened is I just have a quicker way to collaborate with somebody or something without pulling other people into it, right? And maybe I don't pull the right people in, right? So I always have kind of the right people to talk to when I need them. And so now I've become more efficient at my job. And if I can explain that to the AI, then I can teach somebody else how to do it, right? I could even automate some of it, show it to them. They basically have an SOP documented in my prompts, and now they can go do the same kind of thing I can do. Well, what does that do? That frees me up to go do my next job or to move through the organization. And so I think it's those kind of things that if we start to teach people how they can leverage it, how they can do it, first of all, they get excited. right? Because it's kind of fun when you can do things faster, especially if you're like, oh God, I can't, if I have to create another PowerPoint deck. And but everything's basically done for you. And then now you just get to spend time creating cool pictures, right? That's kind of fun, right? More fun than slugging through moving bullets and trying to format a document. What I've seen as people start to touch it and they start to automate things and can prove and basically be able to report, hey, this used to take me, I do this once a month, and it used to take me like a week and a half to do it. Now I can gather information and get it done in about 2.5 hours. And that's so it saves me like 10 hours, the numbers, but it saves me like 10 hours every month, right? That's pretty cool, right? That gives you a lot of time back to either do something else or maybe go home on time once in a while, right?
I look at that, Marty, from two lenses. One, my company relies on AI. We're small, we're adaptable, we're nimble, and we use AI to help us get there because of the things you're talking about. I no longer have to go consult with the design firm and get 2-week turnaround on some marketing deliverables. There's tools out there. There's really good self-starting tools, especially for small business. So it's a big enabler for me. But then I have to contrast it to things that we've seen over the past couple decades. Look at OKRs or design thinking or many others. But in those two examples, really good ideas that were brought out and people thought they were expert on because the idea seemed so simple. And then you had CEOs going, well, anybody can be a product manager because they know design thinking, because that's what I was taught design thinking is. And you had executives go, anybody can build an analytics strategy because OKRs are so simple. And that's what I was taught. The book said it, and the framework looks real easy. And then they went that route and they spent over, many years fundamentally dismantling and destroying some of the things that were in there because not anybody can do it. I guess my concern with AI is really easy to get into. Anybody can find it accessible, but it doesn't feel like industry is treating it seriously enough now to say this is how to responsibly use it to enable yourself with the tools and equipment to get this done. We've got AI agile coaches, AI product coaches, AI engineering coaches that aren't like the good solid built models. They're just a GPT. Somebody put a quick prompt into and called it that, right? So I think my concern and one of the big problems I see with AI is we're making it look real easy, but we're not starting with the safety and the bias and the transparency and the tailored models to do the right thing. And I worry we're going to break industry and break people along the way.
What I think is happening is people are bundling things into tools and saying, hey, use this tool. This is your answer. And it's not the answer. But let me contrast this a little bit. So if I'm getting ready to do some product stuff, so let's make it pretty straightforward. And Scott and I have talked about these things for a long time. So let's say I'm at a client and I want to talk to them about creating a really good problem statement and understand how to do that. I would call Scott in and ask Scott to either train me so I can go train other people, or hey, can you come in and let's start them down the path? I'll hear what you're saying. I'll at least know if they're going off course. And then if it looks like it's getting really bad, I'll call you back in, right? Or have you review it. And this is why I think buying tools right now is not a good idea. I think what you need to do is if you teach everybody how to use it, then I can do things like if Scott has information out on the web or a template or a format, and I trust Scott, I know Scott, I can now start using that in conjunction with AI, right? So if Scott has a format or a blog on how to do a really good problem statement, I can use that as input and context and say, okay, help me write a problem statement according to Scott Sehlhorst's format. And now what it's going to do is it's not only going to use Scott's format, but if you give it the documentation and you ask it questions, it's going to be like Scott is answering your question. Now, if you take that and extend that and say, okay, add Scott and maybe 2 or 3 other people. And so now what you start to do is develop your kind of team of experts for product management. These are people you trust, maybe you've read part of their books or you've read their books or gone to their training class. So now what happens is I'm building my own custom tool now. And I'm using all that knowledge of people I trust and I understand where they're coming from. And I'm interacting with the AI now. I'm not taking what it said because we know it can hallucinate. We know it's not always perfect, but I'm looking at the information and now I can react to it. I can say, hey, that doesn't make any sense. I was looking at the format and it looks like that I should have better financial information in my problem statement. Oh yeah, you're correct. What would you like to add? Right. And we've all seen this, and that's how you would chat with it. And then you'd come out with a response that now makes sense to you. And you can defend it because you know how it got to the response because you interacted with it. If you give that to some product management tool and something comes out the back end and somebody challenges you, if you're new, you're going to have you have no response. You're like, I don't know, that's what the tool told me was the right answer. Because that is a problem, right? You get people that with a year experience, if they're acting like they have 10 years experience, that's a problem. They haven't been through the trials and tribulations of mistakes. So I think that AI can level you up a couple of notches, but you also have to understand how to leverage it and how to pull in experts and collaborate with the right people.
Marty, you hit on a point that is really key for me, which is sort of thinking about that continuum of it's helping you do things that you already know how to do. But that's not a binary. There's just sort of the next step of helping you do things that are adjacent to what you already know, but you basically understand, right? Because knowledge isn't like these crisp lines of I know this and then a slight variation I don't know at all. There is like a hazy boundary. And so you're moving into this sphere of what you still understand, but maybe don't know precisely how to do, where the templates and the structures can come in and help. It's sort of like the bumpers in a bowling alley that help your little kid hit some pins. But you can keep going. Like I start to think about the knock-on effects and exactly your point of the person with 1 year acting as if they have 10 years of experience, where they're asking a generative AI tool to generate something for them that they genuinely don't understand. We've seen people do that without tools, misapplication of templates and patterns and OKRs and generalized structures and org design, like whatever you want to think about. There are people who have an insufficiently deep understanding of what the effects of how they're trying to do what they're trying to do might be. That's a real problem because it gets harder for us to help course correct, right? John's point about breaking industry, I keep talking about it as like an uncanny valley where you can look at something and know that it's bad, know that it came from the person who has a tenth of the perspective, skill, and experience that they need. You know it's wrong because there are signals that it's problematic that encourage you to dig in before you pull the trigger and apply it, right, in a meaningful way.
Right.
And those signals go away because so many of the things that would show up as looking wrong because the underlying thinking was wrong no longer look wrong. And the underlying thinking is wrong, right? It's like this 2x2 of good and bad versus right and wrong, and how you get into that space. That's where I really get worried is the people who are running downhill and using these tools, they get way out over their skis.
I, completely agree with statements like that. So I think what happens is we need to start thinking about how do we work and how do we leverage our experts in our organization, right? Because I remember I learned this so early in my career by accident is I worked for this software company and we had people, they were very good in very specific lanes, but they would walk into meetings and because they were thought of as the guy in the industry for this, if they said anything about something else and sounded really convincing, everybody just believes them. And a lot of times they were wrong. And if you're a junior, like I was sitting there, I'd been there a year, and somebody was saying something, I'm like, that makes no sense. Like I'm looking at it, it doesn't work like that, right? But you're in the meeting with all these people that think this guy is brilliant. You're like, I'm not saying anything because you just assume that you missed something, right? You go back and you look, and sure enough, you were right, but you lose that moment. And I think we have that same opportunity with AI. And one of the things that I've seen people do that I think as they use this more and more is it's not just something to generate. You can actually validate the outputs with something, right? So if I'm brand new product manager and I'm working with you, Scott, and I'm going to create artifacts. you have what your job would be to review those, right? So one of the things that you could build is a GPT that reviewed my thing. I'm building the thing, you're writing a GPT to validate the thing, and now I'm learning from you again because I'm seeing the validations and the questions and any changes I want to make. This all ties back to everybody, every role in and every deliverable in the organization. If they use Gen AI to help them in those roles, then like your job to automate is going to be your job is to validate. SME's job is to validate. Mine is to generate. And so you work through that together and you end up with a better product. The other thing you end up with is I can explain to you how I got there. Right now, I don't know exactly what the LLM's doing when I send stuff to it, but I know what I asked and I know the response I got. Right. And so it's not a black box tool. To your point, I was trying not to use a coding example, but you're right. If I say, hey, write some JavaScript code to do X, blah, 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 and it'll give me a dump of a file, and maybe it's pretty good, but I understand architecture a little bit, right? So if I just change that prompt by saying, do this, but keep single responsibility and separation of concerns in mind and put it into a file structure that would make sense in a JavaScript, right? And sure enough, it'll come back and it'll tell me for this file, and here's the folder structure. Here it is, and it'll break the code out for me. And it's far more performant, probably even easier to maintain, right? So just some simple things, but it goes to what you're saying is if you understand the job, the better the output's going to be, right? So everybody's going to you're going to level up the AI and the AI is going to level you up. So you're just going to move faster in the direction you want.
So I've got a question, Marty. I want to pivot just a little bit to how do we enable the people and the orgs for this? As you see this rolling out, we're talking a lot about the theoreticals, how it can support. We're talking a lot about how the models are there and we can leverage them, but I see very few places focusing on the process, the procedure, the compliance, those sorts of things, right? When we especially think of it in an enterprise view, but even down to the small business, we need to document it somehow. We've got to do the change management somehow. Do you see specific roles growing that should be responsible for that? Do you see it as an overall organizational shift? Is there a framework that needs to be stood up? How do you see the organization get a handle around all of the things that have to change? When we look at Agile's not just a process change, it's an organizational design change, it's a skill set change, it's a mindset change, it's a culture change that emerges out of it. Like there's so much. And AI touches everywhere. There's not a piece of your business that isn't touched here. So, do you see specific roles growing for that, specific skill sets just for the how do we do this sort of people?
To me, there's kind of two things that are going on. We say AI in a general sense. And what's happened is the reason it got so popular recently is because of Gen AI. So to me, Gen AI, if you look at it now, it can be used other places, right? But if you think about it horizontally across your operational teams, then there's a bottom-up approach that I think needs to take where everybody on the operational teams just knows how to use it and uses it every day, and they're moving forward. And you can start that today. And then there's where does AI fit into my business capabilities? Where does that go? Now, when we start doing that, that's when you start to the rest of the organization that already exists, right? You have compliance, you have security. They need to come up to speed on what are those things that I have to worry about with AI. Now, I've seen roles start to emerge as like head of AI. But again, what we've seen in Agile is if you keep those roles separate and not integrated with everything, you're going to run into a problem. So I look at it a lot like how we used to set up an agile transformation is we would sit down and we would go through and say, okay, what business capabilities do you want to enhance? Where is it we're going to go? And you're going to pick a slice. And when you pick that slice, you go, okay, are there any compliance issues? I don't know. Okay, somebody needs to look at compliance issues if we integrate AI. Do we have anybody in the compliance area that understands that? No. Okay, we need to either upskill somebody or probably bring somebody in, right? Is it a consultant? Is it a new hire? And so, yeah, I think roles like that need to exist. things when and the way like testing roles, right? The way you would validate an LLM in production is different than unit testing, right? It's not a yes or no answer. So how do you validate that? And then how do you manage a project like that? And then product managers in that area. So there are some new roles or new skills in roles that need to exist. But security compliance, some of the security things I think people are getting a little too worked up about. And not that you shouldn't be worried about security, but we run things in the cloud all the time. What is your how does your organization handle that? In some organizations, they pull it in and they run everything in their own servers. Well, if that's your case, then you need to bring an LLM inside your firewall, right? It's more expensive, but if security is that important to you, those are the kind of things you're going to do. And so yeah, I think these roles, in some cases they're going to extend, or people need to be brought into those different areas to make sure everybody's aligned. But I don't think you want it separate. It worries me when I hear people talk about it separate, because that's we ran into that when we looked at agile organizations and how they siloed things, and it created problems.
So Marty, if I were pulling on that handkerchief that you laid out, I imagine like the magician where you pull the handkerchief out of their cuff and it's color after color after color, and it's all part of one thing. This is part of what John teed up earlier as what are the key characteristics we have to solve for the safety of the organization so that we don't break the company or the industry. And I think of it the same way that I think about trying to not break the company when humans are involved. And what I mean by that is, how do you design your process to be resilient to bad inputs so that when a bad idea gets into the system, because maybe somebody who didn't understand used a tool which generated something that got pushed in, it's from this point forward, it's the same as if somebody who didn't understand used their own tools to create a bad idea and pushed it into the system, right? It doesn't matter that it was AI. I mean, maybe the threat surface is bigger because it's so much easier to put bad ideas into the system. But how do we design the process or the organization with the kinds of feedback loops or checks and balances or whatever approach we take to develop some resiliency to bad ideas so that we don't have stories of the company killed itself by executing on this hallucination?
When I do think of the big digital transformation moves, whether that was to Agile or to cloud or to internet, there's always been some body, some center of excellence, or some transformation group that emerges for that. And then where it goes wrong, they stay forever, and you're in a continuous transformation cycle. Where it goes well, that body is integrated into the business. It's just absorbed and it becomes the way of working. So if you have an enterprise PMO and you go agile, eventually your lean agile center of excellence goes down and your PMO just does agile. It's just the way you work. I feel like for AI to be implemented properly, because there's a lack of awareness on the expertise it takes, the regulatory compliance, the fiduciary compliance, the data compliance, the things you're talking about, right? We're training a model in the wild with our data. Our data's not going out. Do we care that the model's getting smarter? Are we literally training something our competition's going to use? Do we bring that in-house? Do we train that model more custom, right? There's these big decisions that there's not enough institutional knowledge right now. So I do feel there is a temporary measure to say, we're going to have an AI council. We're going to have an AI lead or something. I don't know that that's permanent. It could be that, you've got your InfoSec lead. That's permanent. Information security is always important. You've got your cybersecurity lead now. That's always important, right? It generally lives in that risk and compliance, security and safety area, and there are people that are specialized in it. So maybe you do have an AI compliance officer in the future just to keep up with GDPR and US regulation and those sorts of things. But to your very specific point, you can't treat it like it's a separate thing from your business. It has to be an integrated strategy to say, we're going to use this group to bootstrap us, get it all figured out, document the policy. But over time, that's an enterprise policy. It's not an AI policy. It's just how the enterprise does business. So when I think about that, and I think about all the people using the tools, and a lot of the training I see is surface level and stuff like that, it gets into how do you use a chat bot versus what's the information security, what's the process procedure, where's the regulatory stuff. I'm not seeing that depth of training or cohorts and stuff out there. Is that something that the industry still has to build? Is it something that people like you and myself and others, we have to go start it? Is that something businesses themselves should start to build internally, to learn the things that they don't know? Or is it something accessible that I'm just not seeing yet? Am I missing a trend?
No, I think you're spot on, right? I believe that there is something, an AI transformation process or group, right? Just like we would bring in agile coaches to come in, help you understand and align the organization. I'm actually working with a group of consultants to build out that type of model, because you do have to go in there. You do need to do an organizational assessment, basically all the things that we did in agile transformations, and understand that, basically you're going to come in and, like you said, it might be a bolt on at the beginning to kind of augment the lack of skills. And then there's a process of how you go through it. How do you identify it? Where's a good place to put a pilot? Once you do the pilot, what's the next thing to do? And then what does that roadmap look like? And I agree that, like, what you would want is for that to happen and then eventually just become the way you do business. And does out of that, if that creates a couple new roles here and there for very specific things, then great. That's what your organization decided, and that's probably the exact right thing to do. That needs to be laid out, because when I go and talk to people, they're struggling. Like, what happens is, and you can see it from a consulting side really easily, because things go really well and all of a sudden they stop and you're like, what stopped? Everything was going great. We're getting ready to sign everything. It's like, yeah, we started thinking about this. We're not really sure about that. Then they name like 9 things. You're like, holy cow, we just talked about that. So there's a lot going on in the organization and there's a lot of confusion. So we need a structured way to go, okay, what skills do we have? What skills do we need? How are you going to grow the business? Why do you want AI in here? How do you train your employees? How do you train your engineers if it's different? All of those things, and you need to kind of talk through them and lay them out.
Getting down to the very personal, individual level, I know for myself, I am reading on this stuff every day. I am out there learning every day. And even for me, I get surprised out of left field. There's all of a sudden this new AI capability that blows my mind. As an individual, how do people stay ahead of it? Because it's freaking scary, man. When you look over and go, that thing can literally do my job now. Yeah, those people are saving a lot of time, but that was my time. That's what I was getting paid for, was to do that thing that now they've got AI for. How do people get ahead or stay ahead or even just keep up right now? What do they do?
Get into it. Get into the middle of it. If I don't know if you recall, was it in the 90s when we started using email? I remember the day I was sitting in my 3270 terminal, and my manager came over and he said, hey, we're going to start using this thing called email. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he shows me, and then he goes, unless you send me an email, I'm not going to respond. So don't leave me notes anymore. Don't do that. You have to send me an email. And I'm sitting there going, what the, I don't even know how to do this thing, right? Like, how do I know it got to him? It was weird, because I was actually a developer and I'm thinking, this is a pain in the butt, man. I don't want to do this. And then, like, the very next thing was the internet. And then all of a sudden, and I had anxiety. I'm like, how am I going to keep up as a developer? I don't know how to do Java. And like, when that started to happen. But what you see is, if you get into the middle of the technology, and, like, let's say all it is that I'm using ChatGPT every day or Microsoft Copilot every day to do my job. And then all of a sudden this new thing comes out. Well, I'm used to playing with this thing over here, so I can at least go look at it and make an assessment as to, does that affect my day job? And if it does, maybe I want to read a little bit more about it. If it doesn't, maybe I want to bury my head in the sand on that one, right? And then decide what things you want to, like, kind of go down the rabbit hole on, which to me feels like everything I read anymore, right? Like when O1 came out a couple of days ago, to spend all day using up my tokens, right? Like, use up my thing. I'm like, why'd I do that? Burn a whole day, right? And it helped me. You know, I learned some stuff, right? And it's good because I'm training people. But most people don't need to go do that right away, right? They can wait, let somebody be the first one, and then have them go, hey, this is where it might be interesting for your job. Or you might have one person in the organization that always has to know the latest thing. But I think if you get into it, get comfortable with the technology, it kind of takes some of that stress away. Maybe not writing engineering white papers. That sounds stressful to me already.
I remember the whole email, Lotus Notes, all those things back in the day. That was a time to be alive. So I have a question on that. The use of it is good. That familiarizes us with the use. How important do you think it is for people to understand the difference between AI? Because every guest we talk to on this podcast, we all have to agree when we say AI, we mean generative AI because that's what people are talking about right now. There's a lot more AI and it's been going a lot longer and it's getting a lot more powerful and it does a lot more things behind the scenes. It's the stuff that you can't necessarily directly talk to. Is it important for people to understand that AI doesn't just mean one thing, or is it really have a user perspective?
I think it depends on your role and what you care about, right? If I'm a product manager and we're going to start using AI in products that I'm going to start putting out, probably should educate myself a little bit, right? Do I need to be an engineer? No, but I need to understand what the capabilities are. And if I say something, what are the implications, right? Like Scott was talking about before, there are plenty of use cases where those models, and they're well-known models, right? You know, regression algorithms to do predictions and things like that. So they're pretty well known. But if they're not well known to your organization, those are the kind of things that you could hire for pretty easily because there are a lot of data scientists and people with that kind of experience. I think where we get into problem like now is when, like, I see job descriptions coming out, and they're very specifically looking for somebody with Gen AI experience to help them build chatbots or something like that. And then there's the requirements are 10 years of Gen AI, 5 years of ML experience. And I'm like, first of all, nobody's got, except unless you're at Microsoft, the guys who are building the models, there's nobody out there that has 10 years of Gen AI experience, right? And then the next thing is that I don't need to be a data scientist to understand how to use the model, right? I'm not building, most organizations, there are some that are building like, financial specific LLMs, right? But they're pulling that in-house and that's a multi-year thing and they're going to spend a lot of money doing that. So they're not hiring somebody with 2 years of experience. These are guys that need to understand the underlying things that make large language models work, right? And so I think people in HR need to understand a little bit better what they're asking for when they're trying to hire these roles. But yeah, I think when you get into the bowels of basically machine learning and deep learning, obviously the developers and I think the product managers, they need to understand the technology.
One of the things you mentioned earlier about sort of anxiety as new enabling technologies emerge, and how do you, the Lewis Carroll quote, we have to run full speed just to stay where we are. I know I've butchered the quote. And I think about how I would have this conversation with a mentee. And I would talk about orienting towards thinking about what is valuable about what you do. Right. So really focusing on the safety for an individual to say, okay, I'm in the company, I've got a role, I've got a job description. What is it that I do that creates value? And then against that backdrop, whatever your collaboration model is, whatever your responsibilities are, right? You can get into all that stuff to say, to use what you do that creates value as your filter for considering what you might explore in terms of the discovery of new capabilities that could make what you do better. John talks about establishing sort of a cadence of daily learning and exploring the different technologies that come ahead and saying, is this something that can help me be more valuable? Yes or no? Instead of saying, I need to try and understand everything that's evolving, right? As the pace of change happens, it becomes less and less practical to stay on top of all of the things. I use a metaphor of going to a river and fishing. You cast your line in while you're there. You don't have a shot at every fish in the river, just the ones that happen to be going by while you happen to be fishing. And that should be enough. So if you focus on the value of your role in how do I get better at doing what I'm already trying to do, I think that's the primary anchor for people to help them be safe as companies figure things out. And that's where I would lean in. It's a little bit different than trying to imagine the ability to do something radically different because a new technology has shown up. I think that's an interesting conversation also, but for most people, I would start with the shorter time horizon focus on how do I get better at the things that are valuable to my employer or my teammates or the people around me, and use that as a lens for evaluating. I need to lean into getting better at prompt engineering. I need to lean into asking for edits and rewrites and generation of new structures for the content that I'm creating, that sort of thing.
I think that's a perfect way to look at it. I love the way you said that. You look at everything, you're in it, do I need to know about this? Does this help me help my organization? Does it help me be better in the organization? What are my personal goals aligned with my company's goals? And that's how you can make those decisions. And then when you think about it that way, it makes you want to learn the Gen AI stuff better, because then what you can do is you can shed all the stuff that's slowing you down to get to there. And that's where you want to be, right? You want to shed all that extra stuff that just time consuming, doesn't take a lot of brain power, but it's just something you almost do by rote now. And if you can kind of shed that stuff, then you have the ability to spend time thinking about what's the next thing.
Marty, how do people get a hold of you if they want to talk more about generative AI, if they want to just look you up and have a chat? How do they find you out there?
The easiest way is LinkedIn, in/Marty Bradley. That's the easiest way to find me.
Well, thank you, Marty, and thank you, as always, Scott. The rest of you can find us at theproblemwithai.com. And now we leave you, as always, with our 100% AI-generated theme song of the week. Enjoy.
Robots taking over, man made of steel. No soul in the circuits, no heart left to feel. Leadership in numbers, businessmen blind. People as data, sentences confined. That's the problem with AI. Doesn't see a heart cry. Talk about the future, but forget why. Ticker-tape machines, cold metal glow. Where's the soul gone? I need to know. Boardrooms in shadows, executives play. Puppets on a string, they just obey. That's the problem with AI. Doesn't see a heart cry. Talk about the future, but forget why. Ticker-tape machines, cold metal glow. Where's the soul gone? I need to know. Boardrooms in shadows, executives play. Puppets on a string, they just obey. That's the problem with AI. Doesn't see a heart cry. Talk about the future, but forget